So as we're coming off of kind of walking through the job analysis process, I want to go back to two of the graphs we started with in the first lecture. And the first one I want to come back to is again just kind of putting it all together, and that is that this process is the objective as possible methodological data-driven measurement of a subjective understanding of what a job is, and that our sources of data are going to include incumbents, employees, people that interact with the job, people that understand the job, supervisors, managers, the person who defined the job, potential customers, and ourselves and potentially other analysts, depending on the level of the job analysis necessary. And again, the kind of lens to hold up to the sources of data is, would the person that's being brought in have an understanding of, or their jobs are required or not required, but their job significantly interacts with the job being analyzed. In other words, we want to make sure we're not just gathering data to gather data's sake. We want to gather data that actually has a meaningful ability to look at the job. Does it have an interaction? Is it logical that they would actually be able to tell you something about the job? And sometimes those interactions are important because a lot of times people, even managers and incumbents, will lose track of how the job affects other jobs. So again, some jobs don't have a strong effect on other jobs, but some jobs are very sequential. They are gathering information from other employees, other job holders, using that information and passing it on to the next line. In that case, both the people they're getting data from or information from or products from and the people they're sending that information or products to may also be good incumbents to look at. As far as methods of collecting data, we want to use the most appropriate methods to the kind of data we're gathering and the number of people we're gathering it from. Obviously, if we have hundreds of incumbents, we're probably going to mainly rely on surveys and questionnaires. If we're only dealing with one or two key people that have a true understanding of the job, definitely probably interviews. We probably at least want to use some kind of archival or in-person observations, and definitely the use of any existing records, including ONET. From that, we kind of talk through the process of job data, tasks, performance standards, responsibilities, knowledge required, skills required, experience, etc. And that again, though compensation may be inferred, generally few job analyses are specifically designed for compensation. They're usually specifically designed for job description and for job specification. And from those, everything else grows. Now, for the job analysis that you have to do in this class, that is a self-directed project. You are going out and finding a job that you plan to analyze, and that could be as simple as a friend or a coworker, or depending on how much you're wanting to kind of beef up your own academic resume or even practice-oriented resume, you may find a small organization that has never done a job analysis that you could do this as a small mini project. I'm good with either. There's a lot of examples of questionnaires that are available already for you on Blackboard, but please note, I don't want you to use them just straight out of the box. I want you to adjust them for your job based on your own reviews and your own understanding of the job. Tailor it for the job. Make sure you're getting good information. There are examples of job analyses, but the main thing I want you to recognize is that you need those components. You need those task lists. They need to be ordered in importance. You need those knowledge and skills. They should be clearly identified and written in the way that we've talked about. You need that job context, and you need that kind of broad description that can be used for recruitment purposes. So you can definitely take a look at that, and also recognize that you do need a full methodological section, including sample information, but that could be in appendices, and it definitely should be at the end of the report. And again, that's primarily for other academic practitioners such as yourself if they ever need to redo the analysis so they know what you did, or if it ever comes under attack in a court case. Now, we're going to move from the job analysis a little bit to just kind of some of the broader theories about person-environment fit, because that's really what we're talking about here, is broadly speaking, job analysis is a major component of PE fit. And PE fit theory basically suggests that if you can measure a person, if you can measure an environment, and you find in a measurement, and you find a person that fits that environment, they're going to fit. And fit results in good outcomes. So if you have someone that's well suited for an environment, they're going to enjoy being in that environment. If you love being in a really big city and having access to lots of different restaurants and lots of different activities, and you take a job, and this isn't even result about organizational psychology or IO psychology, but you take a job in a small town of 500 people, you're not going to have good fit, and the outcomes are going to be poor satisfaction, poor motivation, poor mood. When I went to grad school in, quite honestly, a smaller Midwestern town, about 20,000 people total, and most of those were involved at the university. One of my fellow graduate students came from a huge city down in Texas, loved city life, and they were miserable in the grad program. They were not miserable because they weren't good grad student. They were a great grad student. They were a great researcher. They were smart. They enjoyed the subject. They loved IO psychology. They loved their classes. They loved their faculty, but they were a poor fit for the environment. The reason I tell this story is that when we're doing a job analysis, remember, environment is a part of it. What is it like to work here? What is it like to be in this job? That is a component that needs to be captured as well, because again, what we're trying to do is set up the base of the pyramid for person-environment fit. Now, most of the environment in this case is not the actual environment like the town or the temperature, it's the job itself, but the job should also capture some of those elements. Because if you have someone that's a very good fit for the job, but a very poor fit for the organization, the organization's goals, or where the organization is at, you're still going to have a negative impact. That's probably not going to be a good hire. It's not a good PE fit. So based on PE fit, I wanted to just briefly go over some broad theories of kind of types of persons and types of jobs and how we can kind of look at that. So this is a little side lecture, honestly, but it moves over a little bit to the O side. But a lot of times when we're doing task statements, when we're thinking about KSAs, when we're thinking about person-environment fit within a job analysis, these are some theories to keep in mind, and they're all fairly similar. So the Ohio State Leadership Studies basically defined that types of people versus types of work could basically be defined by initiating structure versus consideration. So initiating structure is how much actual task focus do you have to be to do well on the job? And consideration is how much time and effort are you willing to spend or is required to spend working with people and treating them like people to do well on the job. Now notice this is a leadership theory, but the idea here is that there are certain roles and certain jobs that are high in both. You need to be high in consideration and high in structure. You have a high concern for production, you have a high concern for getting the task done, but you also have a high concern for people. You can also have a low concern for production and a low concern for people. You can have a high concern for production and a low concern for people. You can have a low concern for production and a high concern for people. Now, a lot of times these theories are presented as if the only good box is the upper right box, but again, it's PE fit. For example, the low concern for production but a high concern for people, that would be a good leader in an organization where the organization is doing well. People are self-motivated, they're getting the job done, but there's a lot of interpersonal conflict that doesn't need to be there. That's where you'd want a low production but a high concern for person manager. And honestly, if you're in a situation where you have highly motivated people that really like each other, are getting the job done, and don't really need to be highly managed, in that situation, you might actually want a low concern for production, low concern for people manager, someone that's not going to get in and mess things up. So again, just recognize that when you're thinking about tasks and skills, one of the ways you can think about them is as you're creating your job analysis, how many of the tasks and skills are initiating structures versus how many of them are consideration. And this same 2x2 model has been reused and relabeled by a lot of different researchers for different purposes. Blake and Morgan basically looked at it from a management style, and again, what they're looking at is they called it concern for task versus concern for relationships, but it's the same idea. I call it social versus task, concern for the social, concern for the task. And again, a lot of these models try to move people up into the top quadrant, the 9-9 team management style, high concern for task and high concern for relationships. And it is true that this type of manager in most situations is probably going to be preferable to the other styles. But again, even then, we're looking at manager environment fit. Now, one of the reasons that the team manager often is a good fit, generally speaking, is that a lot of these people are also more flexible. So they can recognize when it's time to focus on task and when it's time to focus on relationships. But notice flexibility or lack of flexibility is not a part of this model. Honestly, that would make it a 2 by 2 by 2 model, and it might be a better model actually, because an inflexible team management style is probably not the best manager for a lot of situations, but a flexible team manager is probably your best bet. Now, again, the only reason I'm going to these theories right now is just to kind of recognize a couple of things. One, we're still fairly early on in the series of lectures, and I really want you to be thinking about broadly how IO psychology looks at the world. And I will honestly tell you, IO psychology looks at the world in 2 by 2 models. You're going to see various versions of the 2 by 2 model where you measure something from high-low versus something else on high-low to kind of create a mind frame or a framework to think about things. And again, the only reason I'm bringing this up right now for the purposes of actual job analysis is that it isn't a bad idea, considering how many of these models are out there, to also be at least thinking about how this job breaks down in this kind of a structure. How important is the job to be focused on relationships versus how important is the job to be focused on tasks? Because that'll also give you some information about the KSAs necessary to do the job. And just to kind of reiterate that we keep seeing these over and over and over again, this is actually Lefton and Bozada's 1970 model, and this is a homegrown model from St. Louis Psychological Associates, one of the independent consulting companies that's actually still run by Dr. Lefton. And his theory, of course, we now have initiates versus avoids versus low respect versus high respect. So we flipped over task and social, but it's still a task social model. And again, in their model, you're looking to be a Q4 leader, forcefully open, requiring task-oriented, but still responsive to employees. So you show respect, but you also initiate tasks. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the difference between competency models versus job analysis. There is a reality to job analyses, and that is that job analyses tend to work very well, as we described, using the methodologies we described, for entry-level jobs or relatively simplistic jobs. As we move up an organization, both in complexity and in management and leadership requirements, the job analysis becomes more and more subjective. In other words, the more complex the job is, the more the job may change radically from day to day on what you're doing. And I'll use my own job as an example. Today, I'm recording lectures. That's all I'm doing. I am teaching asynchronously today from about 8 a.m. till probably about 5 p.m. with a couple of breaks for meetings. Those of you that had Zoom meetings with me this day will probably know when I recorded this lecture. Anyway, my point though is that if you did a typical questionnaire about my job, it would vary greatly depending on what day I was filling it out. I've got 2 days slated next week where I'm not doing any lectures, I'm not talking to any students, I'm sitting down and running data analysis for some papers that I'm writing. So again, that's not even paper writing, that's not even research, that's just literally me being a quantitative psychologist for a couple of days. So there's a lot of variance in my job, which means that a job analysis to truly capture my job is going to be a lot harder to do. And it's going to be a very long job analysis. There's a lot of tasks, there's a lot of knowledge and skills and abilities necessary to do what I do, and to do it fairly successfully in a way that is recognized by my peers as job success. The other problem with this is that the job analysis is really focused on individual tasks and skills. And generally speaking, as you move up the chain of management, a lot of times those knowledge and skills become less clearly identifiable. And what starts to become more important at a top level of an organization is your fit with the organization's culture. So basically speaking, at the bottom of an organizational structure, the more simplistic jobs, the more managed jobs, the more entry-level jobs, our PE fit is person-job fit. However, as you move to the middle level of organization, middle management, upper management, and C-suite, you start to see that PE fit is less about whether you can do the job. You clearly can do the job. You've been in the organization for a while and you've been promoted. It's more about your fit with the company. So it's now person-company fit. And that's where competency models come in. Job analyses models are bottom-up models. They're mainly focused at the base of the organization and the largest number of jobs in the organization. A competency model is actually a top-down model that is looking at what are the key competencies that are necessary at the top of the organization and hopefully ideally identify competencies that at least are still relevant at the bottom of the organization. Now, before we even get into more detail of exactly what a competency model is, I also want to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of competency models. Competency models usually are much more manageable and understandable and useful to HR decision making at the top levels of organization. When you're doing executive searches, when you're doing upper level management searches, a competency model may give you a better predictive model of who's going to be a good fit because all of the applicants are probably coming in with 10 plus years of experience where you're no longer necessarily needing to define their job into individual tasks and ask, can they do those tasks? However, as that competency model moves down through an organization, it becomes less and less likely to predict. For example, if you find there are 7 key competencies that anyone in an organization needs to be successful in fitting with the company, you might find someone at an entry-level job that is a perfect fit for all 7 of those competencies. They're a perfect fit for the company. Unfortunately, you're hiring a forklift driver and they don't know how to drive a forklift because you didn't ask them, do you actually have the KSAs and the actual ability to do the tasks required to do this job? Likewise, going upwards with a job analysis, you might find someone that, of course, has the economic skills, the accounting skills, the management skills necessary to be a CFO in the organization. But they come from a very militant kind of structured organization, and this is a free-flowing tech company, and they're a horrible fit for the company. They strife and argue with everyone. They're a bad hire. So you can kind of see how neither job analyses or competency models work perfectly throughout the organization. However, both of them have their advantages and strengths and reasons for existing. And ideally, I would argue that the best practice and the best science is for an organization to have both. There should be job analyses up through at least the middle management levels, and there should be a competency model that honestly does capture the key competencies all the way to the base of the organization. But again, which you use or if you use both are going to be dependent on the level of the organization that you're at. So I'm going to just walk through an example of a competency model. One of the articles that you were assigned really goes through the process of doing competency models. So basically, Anheuser-Busch, quite a few years ago, decided to do a competency model for their entire organization. And they started by reviewing other models within Anheuser-Busch. So they basically asked what competencies are already being used, what individual branches are basically in their own paperwork kind of talking about what is a good employee. They then benchmarked other Fortune 100 companies to find out what competencies they were looking for in their employees. They then reviewed their vision, mission, and objective statements to find out how this all fit, and then they identified their key business imperatives: growing the business, focusing on customers, and operational efficiency. So once they knew these are the 3 things that we really are trying to drive our business towards. We want our business to grow. We want to make sure that we're known for being customer focused, and we want to be as efficient as possible in doing the top 2 things. They then identified competencies for success. In other words, what competencies would an individual at any level of the organization have to basically help them and make them likely to want to be moving in these same directions as well. So they came up with a competency model, and this is a fairly long one. A lot of the times we're going to see competency models in the neighborhood of 7 to 9 items. They came up with 13. 13 competencies which would work throughout the organization. Now remember, these work best with more obscure, more skill-driven, more higher-level jobs. So wanting to achieve a competitive advantage: customer focus, business focus, innovative and change, result-oriented, analysis and planning, systems thinking, technical functional expertise, succeeding through people, valuing people, commitment to development, professionalism, empowerment, influence, and team orientation. So a couple of those, let's just grab out 10 and 13, professionalism and team orientation. What this basically can tell you right off the bat is that if you tend to be very non-structured, dress how you want, show up when you want, this is probably not an organization that you're going to fit in well with. And team orientation, if you tend to be a loner, if you tend to want to just get your job done without incorporating others, again, this is telling you that's not going to really work well at any level of the organization. So once we actually have an actual competency, we now have to determine what is that competency? We have to define it, kind of just like a job analysis task. Customer focus aggressively monitors and anticipates customer requirements and responds to them in an appropriate manner. So that's the definition that is going to work throughout the company, and that starts to give us a little bit of what we need to measure. So aggressively monitor and anticipates. That starts to tell us some knowledge, skills, and abilities someone might need to have customer focus. And then we want to break it down. Now, again, just like job analyses, we're not going to break it down to micro levels, but we do want to ask at what various levels would customer focus look different? And we have 3 examples here: an individual contributor, a manager, and a senior manager. So this tells us you work for the company doing a specific task, you manage people who work at the company doing specific tasks, or you're actually at kind of the senior level executive management. So for an individual contributor, you know and anticipate and understand customer needs within the actual customers you actually interact with. Manager and supervisor clarifies for others what's the responsibility to customers, and senior management creates an open communication with senior people in internal and external organizations. So customer focus in the case of senior management is with supply chains and basically other organizations that buy the products. So the customer may change how you identify, but the actual customer focus is still present at all 3 of these levels. So again, if we just left it at customer focus aggressively monitors and anticipates customer requirements and responds to them in an appropriate manner, that doesn't necessarily tell us how does this behavior look at different levels of the organization. Once you actually have your competency model and you have your various levels, now you need to find out, does it actually work? So you validate this. And how we actually typically do this is we will actually use the competency model, and each competency will have various questions, and each question set may be varied by the level. So going back to the last slide, for instance, there may be a set of 4 or 5 questions that are meant to measure the construct of customer focus if you're an individual contributor, if you're a manager, or if you're a senior manager. And those may be different questions. We then give everyone in the organization the competency model and measure their competencies by their own self-report. We might also do this where we combine kind of a 360-degree evaluation where we have customers rate them, we have them rate themselves, and we have their supervisors rate them. Again, it depends on how much time, money, and effort you want to put into this. But what you're now looking for is that if the competencies are truly relevant and the way you're measuring them are tied to how people are actually doing their job, what you should find is the people high in the competencies are also your top performers, and people low in the competencies tend to be lower performers. You're expecting to find expected differences across the organization and across those levels. If you find that, you've validated your competency model. And then you can start HR programs linking through those core competencies. You can use it for recruitment selection, performance management, training development, and succession planning. But I do want to note that if you use it for selection, especially entry level, you probably need to still pair it with job analyses. So conclusion, job analysis is important. It's important, it's important, it's important. O-Net makes the job analysis a lot easier by giving us a place to start. And competency modeling is a relatively new approach, and a lot of organizations have tried to use competency modeling as a replacement to job analysis. That's kind of been slowly fading away. That push is kind of disappearing as more and more, I think, much like when we talked about the types of job analysis, we talked historically, there was a work approach and there was a worker approach, and now we're at a hybrid approach. I think a lot of organizations are moving much to what I've been talking about, the hybrid approach. Having both a competency model that is primarily used at higher levels, but can still guide selection at lower levels, and job analyses being used at lower levels to do the job. Also, I should note that especially for entry-level jobs, the courts are still showing a fair amount of deference to job analysis over competency modeling. If you're using competency modeling for entry-level jobs, it's better than not having any model that you're using for the purposes of selection, but it is not viewed as favorably in the courts as a traditional structured job analysis.